Great. So this event is based out of Vancouver, and we acknowledge that we are on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. We thank them for having cared for this land and look forward to working with them in partnership as we continue to build this great city together. A bit over a year ago, the CIC, along with its 16 branches across Canada, set out its vision for a major initiative aimed at defining Canada's foreign policy going into the 2020s. We are now proud to launch a major deliberative democracy initiative, along with our two partners. Foreign Policy by Canadians aims to give a voice to Canadians from all backgrounds and walks of life in shaping Canada's position in a changing world. Through events such as this one, we aim to foster educated discussions on various issues that matter to Canadians in order to produce policy recommendations that hopefully deliver results. The main themes which we have decided to discuss include global public health, human security, economic development, and climate change. This evening's event on energy policy promises to be very interesting, and I'd like to thank our speakers and moderator for joining us. Our moderator is George Benson. George P.R. Benson is a resilience practitioner and thinker working on urban resilience, climate action, and equitable and inclusive economic development. He is the co-founder of the Climate Migrants and Refugees Project, a nonprofit raising awareness and building solutions to address climate change, displacement, and currently works on decarbonization and resilience planning in Vancouver and around the world. He is the North American lead on climate action within the World Economic Forum's Young Leaders Network, the Global Shapers community, has served in the leadership of both the Canadian and American Urban Planning Associations, and has been both a Canadian and civil society delegate to the UN and other global forums. In 2018, he was awarded the City of Vancouver's Award of Excellence for his work on climate action and equity. Without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to George so that he can lead us into the event. Thank you very much, George.
Thank you so much, Ben. And thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to our speakers. I want to reaffirm and support that lovely land acknowledgement you've given, Ben. I think there's often a tendency in our work to separate some of these very real domestic issues we face in terms of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. But of course, these are part and parcel, and I think a core part of the work we need to do to address energy and climate issues as well. So I think it's a relevant theme to bring into this whole conversation. I'm so pleased to be with all of you today. I have been a longstanding fan of CIC. The speakers and I were talking about some past relationships we've had to it. It's a great forum to raise really important questions like we're going to address today. So I thank you all for spending your time with us this evening, and I'm looking forward to what we can come up together. So I'm gonna lay out a little bit of context here, and I'm gonna try to speak about this very, very quickly. But I wanna try and cue us all up for some of what's at stake when we're talking about the geopolitics of climate and energy. And I'm gonna open this by suggesting that at a very high level, there are really two core questions that we face as Canadians, as a globe, and I think we're gonna get into these today across our three speakers here when we're talking about climate and energy. The first question is pretty profound, even though it sounds quite simple, and that's, are we going to get to net zero carbon emissions globally by or before 2050? The answer to that question will radically shape our world one way or the other. And I think from our speakers today, we're going to understand some of the implications of getting to that or not getting to that in different contexts. But almost equally relevant, and really what will define whether or not we get to this net zero or not, is what the mix of energy sources and energy suppliers will be to fulfill the very large and indeed growing demand for energy that we have around the world. As Canadians, it's particularly important that we recognize what these questions are and what they mean for us. Again, the answers to these will define our world in one way or another, but as a major producer of energy, as a major producer of natural resources, and indeed as one of the largest GHG emitters in the world and a longstanding historical emitter, having smart, robust, thoughtful, strategic answers to these questions is what's going to set us up for success in the very changing, fluid geopolitical era that we find ourselves in. As sort of setting the stage for kind of where we are at as a country, I think it's important to remind ourselves that while we have fairly robust and ambitious targets by global standards in the internationally determined contributions to the UNFCCC, we are still not meeting them. Our 2030 targets, we are not in line to meet. And while we are potentially set to adopt net zero carbon reduction goals for next year during when Parliament resumes, it's still not clear that we will be on track to meet those, even with all the various local, national, regional, provincial climate targets that are out there. And those targets are important, but they're not the end all and be all of this, right? The substance of our policy, the investment choices we make are critical if we're going to achieve this on a domestic level. And of course, if we're going to be perceived as serious when we're in the international forums that we attend, talking about climate, environment, energy, and et cetera. We have many billions of dollars being deployed in natural resource projects that are oil and gas focused here in the country. As well, we have many billions of dollars we're spending globally to advance climate action, both mitigation and adaptation around the world. The mixture of these various policies, priorities, investments is complicated. And I think we're going to hear from our speakers tonight about just how complicated they are and where the trade-offs perhaps in either altering, shifting, increasing, amplifying any one of those or all of those goals, ambitions, targets, et cetera, that we have here. So I'm not going to pontificate at you folks for very long here. I'm going to turn this over to our speakers very quickly. The agenda for our conversation today is we're going to work through a few questions as a panel here. I'm going to ask our speakers to reflect on a little bit of the kind of themes implied in the title of this event. And then we're going to turn it over to you. So we're going to have a dialogue with all of you where we can hear more from you, what you think is important, and get some questions to our speakers rather, who have a wealth of knowledge in a number of different areas here. So I'm excited to hear from them. I'm not going to read our speakers' bios here. They're very accomplished folks in a number of different realms. In fact, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn it over to them. I will say that we're very lucky to have Dr. Andy Hira, who's a professor of political science at Simon Fraser University with us. We have Ed Greenspan, who's the president and CEO of the Public Policy Forum. And we have Eddie Perez, who's the international policy analyst for the Climate Action Network here in Canada. And we're very lucky to have them all with us today. So I'm going to start with a quick, easy question for all of us, which is for each of you folks to tell us a little bit about the core parts of your work and how they relate to Canada's energy policy and climate in the context of geopolitics. So Dr. Hira, I'll turn it over to you first, please.
Okay, thanks very much for having me. I am a professor at Simon Fraser University, specializing in international development, innovation, and technology. I head up the Clean Energy Research Group, and we have two different missions. One is to inform policy from a neutral and objective perspective to look to the long term in terms of Canadian and provincial strategy. And the second one is to help off-grid communities, both in Canada and overseas, to shift from diesel, biomass, or kerosene towards renewable energy systems.
Thank you, Dr. Hira. Next, I will turn to Mr. Greenspan, please.
Thank you very much, George. I guess I'll just start with a very quick bio of my own, and as well, and just say that I head up a think tank. I am a journalist by life's vocation, and most of my career with the Globe and Mail. Also worked out in Western Canada and Europe, and then I sort of wrapped up my journalism career as the global managing editor for energy and environment at Bloomberg News, with a team in 22 countries, and Canada was not in the top ranks of those 22 countries. I would say we spent a lot of time in New York, arguing about what role policy would play and what role markets would play in changing the world. And I think it's still a good argument. I think if we don't get markets with their innovative capacities set up right by policy frameworks, then we won't be moving forward at all. So that's what we're concentrating on at the Public Policy Forum. We have two initiatives. One is a sustainable finance initiative. In fact, we had a meeting today that included the Governor of the Bank of Canada, who, as you know, was the chair of the expert panel on sustainable finance. And we have a second initiative, which we call the Energy Future Forum. And the Energy Future Forum is made up of energy producers, including the major oil sands producers, about 4 or 5 environmental groups, some indigenous representatives, some finance representatives, some utilities, and others. And we're trying to get them to wrap their minds around what just to your point, George, there's 2030 and there's 2050. They're not exactly the same route to each one, but I think if you skip over 2030, it's not a very credible thing to do public. 2050 is too far off. So we're trying to, get them to wrap their minds around what is necessary to do and achieve three simultaneous goals. One, of course, is to meet our targets and to have a safe planet. The second is to have a strong and innovative economy along the way. And the third is to have a unified country.
That's a great overview.
Very tough policy.
That's the easy stuff. Nothing too difficult. I'm sure you guys will have a report in a few weeks here. Thank you very much, Ed. That's a great overview of the work you folks are doing at PPF. And finally, last but not least, to Eddie Perez. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, George. My name is Eddie. I mean Jojage, which is the unceded territory that we commonly known as Montreal, Quebec. Thank you, CIC, for inviting me to this panel. Climate Action Network is Canada's largest network of organizations working on climate change. We currently have more than 120 members in the country. We work in 130 countries, but the Canadian network also brings together the largest unions, development organizations, humanitarian organizations, indigenous groups, and grassroots organizations from around the country. My job particularly is, I am the lead on international policy and diplomacy, particularly on, of course, issues related to the climate regime. So every year we're part of the COP26, the Canadian delegation that goes to COP26, COP25, and the other COPs. I also lead the G7 Climate and Energy Working Group, and we work closely with the Canadian government on the negotiating elements on climate and energy and biodiversity and all the other topics that are adding into the agenda these past couple of years. And yeah, I mean, the work right now is, as Mr. Greenspoon just said it very well, speaking about the urgency of this moment and how different 2030 it is than 2050. But at the core of it is, how do we define urgency at the core of all of our decisions and what it means for policy.
Another great opener. Thank you all. The first question, sort of substantively, we're going to ask you folks is when I was looking through the sort of event overview of this, when I was asked to be moderator, I noted that there was it seemed to be implied that Canada had a set of unified interests when it comes to climate and energy. And I would like to ask each of the panelists here, starting with Ed, to give your view. Does Canada have a unified set of interests when it comes to climate policy, or are they disparate by sector or region? And in either case, what are the interests at play within Canada here that are relevant when we're talking about climate and energy?
Well, I guess to start with, in a big overview sense, I think Canadians do have a common interest. They have a common interest in living in a safe planet. They have an interest, those of us who have children have an interest in making sure that 2050, 2060, 2070 are going to be as full of opportunity as it is here in 2020. So I think we have that interest, the road to that interest, but we travel very, very different roads to get there. I mean, if you live in Quebec, you've been blessed with a lot of hydro potential, which the province was very innovative in developing. Not with climate change in mind, of course, but was innovative. And of course, it was controversial at the time in terms of Indigenous rights. If you live in Alberta, you were blessed with this pool of tar, bitumen, oil sands, whatever different people want to call it, and it's very political what you call it. And they were also enormously innovative in developing that, not to ruin the planet in any way, but to power the country. And it did power the country and the continent, and still does for many years, and earns us great export earnings. So you're in different places, and you have different routes to get there. The challenge, obviously, for Alberta and Saskatchewan to a lesser extent Newfoundland and British Columbia, all that have oil and gas interests, is going to be much tougher. Having said that, oil is going to be with us a long time. Only 3.5% of cars sold today are net zero cars. So, we've got a long declining run. History is only moving in one direction, but it, won't move on a just, straight line.
Okay, thank you very much. I will turn now to Eddie. What are your thoughts? Unified interests, what are they?
Yeah. So when you asked me that question, I thought about it in two different ways, and totally I share Mr. Greenspoon's comments about the regional differences that we have in this country, and how that also applies to the use of resources. I am from Quebec, and I understand those in Alberta that we have definitely different energy sources, and it makes it a little bit difficult when it comes to energy transition elements. But that said, I think I'm going to move into the other one, which is on the sectors, and thinking a little bit about diplomatic interests in itself. And I think the first point that I would say is that today we're this year we're celebrating the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement, which is a landmark international treaty. It was when that text was adopted, Canada said that it was back, and that showed great willingness to really bring in some of those sectoral interests that Canada is good at. So Canada is an amazing front runner on diplomatic affairs related to human rights, to gender. Canada has been a front runner when it comes to feminist international foreign policy. And this is something that I think Canadians share very well. And I think, in terms of G7, G20, the presence of Canada is as an honest broker that was able to be there to build bridges at a moment where our neighbor, the United States, was disrupting these international processes and UN institutions. So in terms of sectoral interest, I think Canada has shown that ability to be a front runner at the diplomatic level. However, I think, one of the key parts, and then building a little bit on what Mr. Greenspoon said, there is an inconsistency in Canada when it comes to energy policy and energy domestic policy. Canada has never met a climate target. Canada has never been able to really align the very strong diplomatic place that it takes when it comes to climate diplomacy with its incoherent domestic approach on climate and energy. And so that really creates an important contrast when it comes to presenting itself. And I think moving now to this moment where we are trying to pick up steam, when we look at COP26 at a moment where Canada needs to revise its domestic planning, both for 2030 and for 2050, that element of interest is going to be at the core of it. First, because Canada can't meet its target alone. You need the provinces to work with you. So you got to convince how are you going to build this federal-provincial relationship on it. Second, because net zero, you have to define what is the net of the zero. And that is another big question that I'm looking forward to discuss with you, particularly when it comes to offsetting the oil and gas sector.
Okay, thank you, Eddie. And last but not least, Dr. Hare.
Sure, I'm a political scientist, so I will answer as such. The answer is no. Canada does not and has never really had a unified strategy towards climate change or energy. We could use the National Energy Policy, the NEP, and its demise, as well as the demise of Petro-Canada as an analogy. The federal government has never been able to get on the same page as the provincial governments. And the reason for that is simple. These different provinces have different energy interests. To state the obvious, there are, as I submitted in my slides, over 130,000 jobs in Alberta dependent on the oil and gas sector. And so the fact that there are more green jobs than there are fossil fuels jobs doesn't outweigh the fact that CAP, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, remains the foremost lobby group in Canada. And the fact is that governments are elected in short-term horizons, 3 to 5 years maximum, right? And we're talking about climate change here as a tragedy of the commons problem that requires thinking out to 15 or 20 years. And so there's a mismatch between the politics and what's necessary for climate change. In the immediate term, the federal government relies heavily, $14 billion annually in revenues from the oil sector, as well as aligned subsidies and tax breaks to the oil sector. And the Alberta government, I don't even need to tell you, it's so highly dependent on oil revenues that to cut that cord in any easy fashion is almost impossible. So this is where we have a mismatch between the necessities for the future generations and the actual political realities in the short term on the ground. And that's reflected, I'll just finish with this. What seems to be irrational to us is actually very rational in a political sense. So in a political sense, the purchase of the Trans Mountain Pipeline makes sense. In a economic or logical sense or environmental sense, it doesn't. But politics here has really been underestimated in terms of understanding climate change.
Can I just add to build on that point? And first off, I want to tell Mr. Perez, Eddie, that I don't like being the old man on the panel, so you can use my first name. You don't have to call me Mr., okay?
My apologies.
You can even call me Eddie. Some of my friends do. So, you know, we're talking about geopolitics here, and we're talking about Canada's place in the world. And you know, Canada doesn't want to be identified in the world by its oil, but Canada's an exporting country, and that is one of the great realities of Canada. We have a small market and big ambitions, so we got to sell things abroad. And the thing that we sell abroad mostly, and too much of it to the United States, but nonetheless, the thing we sell abroad mostly is oil. Canada has a current account deficit every year of $50 to $60 billion. 11 years in a row, we've been in negative territory. That's not very good for a country, but in positive territory has been our energy exports by $76 billion. So that's a huge amount if you would lose, and 90% of that $76 billion is oil and gas. The third category is actually coal. Electricity is only the fourth category in terms of our exports. So we're going to have to go through a transition, and it's going to be a difficult transition. And that transition is going to have to include certainly a long phase of cleaning our oil and gas. It's going to have to be investment in carbon capture, a move towards a hydrogen future, hopefully, if that works. There's going to have to be all sorts of electrification of the oil sands, just like the Norwegians have electrified their offshore. We have a lot of work to do because you can't be idealistic about real people's lives to the point about all the jobs that are at stake there.
One of the things I'd note that's of interest is Canada at the subnational level, and actually, and I think increasingly at the national level, has provided a number of declarations or policy supports to language either at the UN level or in other sort of non-state forums around the just transition. And of course, the just transition work that was done in Alberta with coal communities is in some ways world leading with the thoroughness with which it was initially done. I think there's some questions now as to where some of that work rests with a different government in power. But certainly the idea of Canada offering not only climate and energy solutions, but also climate, energy, and equity solutions. And of course, the oil and gas community has always been very keen to promote the idea, and with some veracity, that Canadian oil and gas is on the lower end of human rights violations on a much more respectable ground when it comes to some of those issues. So there's an interesting confluence of both an imperative for Canada in terms of protecting jobs and keeping folks at work, but also in terms of the equity work we may or have already undertaken, there could be other work there. I wonder, Dr. Hira, I saw you nodding there. Do you want to jump in on that comment? Because I think you might have some ideas on both of those points.
Yeah, I don't want to take up too much time, but I think you're on to a very important point. And we've seen this time and time again in terms of globalization. The populist backlash we're seeing is from the huge hemorrhaging of manufacturing jobs, principally to China, in Europe, and in the United States. And so it's these losses that Edward and I have been talking about are tangible losses and in the short term. And at the same time, if you look at the bigger picture of things, we know the environmental and health effects of using fossil fuels is vastly underestimated and undercounted. We really underestimate the cost of continuing to use these fossil fuels beyond climate change, and those costs definitely accrue upon more marginalized communities. And B, there's this huge opportunity. We're at the verge of a clean energy revolution now, and that's reflected in these discussions around the Green New Deal in the US and in Europe. That is, we have an opportunity like we're on the verge of an industrial revolution or a knowledge revolution with the introduction of the internet. Canada has the chance to move into the forefront and capture some of the new jobs that will come with clean tech. But those opportunities and the political weight that would come with them are prospective. And the political problem we have now is that the losses of jobs are definite and they're very clearly going to be hurtful and concentrated in losses to certain communities. So I really think that, besides the Pan-Canadian climate change framework, and Canadian government needs to have a transition plan, not only for marginalized communities, but for the oil-producing provinces as a whole. We need to be able to convert these communities towards clean tech. And just to finish, I wrote a book a couple years ago about why Trump won the election. And one of his pitches was to blue-collar workers and to coal miners in West Virginia. He never delivered on those promises. Even if you look in Germany, coal miners still have a huge political weight and they're holding up the climate change transition. So until we have a positive plan for these communities that will be negatively affected by the transition, we're not going to be able to sell this politically.
Yeah, maybe if I could add just a bit on what Dr. or Andy just said. I think at the global level, 2020 is such an interesting year. Global coal generation fell 8.3% in the first half of 2020 compared to the same period in 2019. There is, this is breaking a record. And when we follow a year to year, it used to be about 3% in 2019. Which actually was the biggest fall since 1990. So there is something happening at this moment where we're seeing big changes when it comes to energy. There is one challenge though. When we look at the trends, the transition is not going into renewable energy, but it's going into natural gas, and it's being put into as a transition for fuel. And I think we have a lot of work cut up for us to really take away that myth that gas is a transition fuel, and we have a challenge right there. But the important element of, and just maybe coming back to the element on just transition, is that we have a tendency, and I do believe that Canada needs a Just Transition Act, but we have a tendency to think that of just transition as a compensation tool, as a remedy tool, when in fact it is a preventive tool. And we have to do preventive just transition policies. There has been, I think Canada was the first country in the world to create a just transition task force following the presentation of the Power and PASCO alliance with the UK. And that brought in very important policies. It was mentioned here in the context of coal workers in Alberta. But the focus on that policy was a lot on remedies. It was a lot on fixing the problem after imposing a transition. And I think we need to really explore how, instead of focusing on the remedies, we actually focus on prevention, which is something that requires a little bit more thinking from our side. Yeah.
That's just before you jump in there, Ed, I think I'll throw one thought of mine in, which is to say that I would even go a little bit further than you, Eddie, and say the just transition is not only a chance for remedy and prevention, but I think ideally for transformation. And I'm as someone who works at the urban level, I think if you look at the case studies of local jurisdictions that are pursuing this, Los Angeles, New York City, Oslo, Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal have pieces at work. They're all seeing this as an opportunity to actually work on long-standing social and economic inequities, and not just provide jobs for those who have, are losing good-paying work in, say, the oil and gas sector today. They're also seeing it as an opportunity to address those at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum who are in some way implicated. Because let's not forget, we're talking about energy here, but we're also talking about transportation. We're talking about buildings. We're talking about waste. We're talking about all the various sort of spiderwebbed ways in which fossil fuels impacts our lives. And not all of those will be on the front page of the New York Times as far as, coal miners in the same way that coal miners in West Virginia are. So there are many who will be impacted, and the opportunities to provide perhaps even greater economic and social upward mobility may rest in that. And I know Dr. Hira has an industrial policy background, so he might have some other thoughts on that as well. But Ed, maybe if I can get you to bridge your thought there with this, which is, because I do want to leave room for audience questions here. We're talking about some streams and themes here, and I think each of you are starting to nail down some core priorities. And I wonder if I can get you, and Ed, feel free to respond to this prior conversation, but get you to talk a little bit about where you think Canada should place some bets let's keep it very open, in geopolitics broadly speaking, where, based on this conversation we've had so far, can Canada place some winning bets as far as the activities, the alliances, and initiatives that we might undertake in global politics? So Ed, I'll throw it to you just so you can bridge from your earlier comment.
Okay, I will avoid going backwards too much, only to say, because I'd really like to, I'm tempted to go backwards, but only because it would be exciting, because I disagree with my colleagues. Just transition is a brilliant phrase. Whoever came up with it deserves, very, very high marks for that phrase. But it doesn't seem very just. Well, it was particular, like anything, it was particular 1, 2, 3, 4 people. It wasn't, we didn't do it collectively as 35 million. It's only just if it's not you being transitioned. It doesn't feel just if you're being transitioned. And having said that, I come from the newspaper industry, and I understand industries in decline. And many of my friends who were journalists are no longer journalists. So I get that economies transition people. I just, wouldn't think that people are going to find it a happy moment. Now, to go to your geopolitical question, though, and try to move forward here. I think that there's some new opportunities that present themselves. There's some very difficult opportunities. I'm gonna ask this question on 2 levels. With whom do we work internationally, and as well, what should our priorities be in terms of how we use our resources, our financial resources? So who do we work with? Oddly, China, with whom we now have awful relations. That's a Donald Trump word, awful, or horrible, and even more of a Donald Trump word. And we have awful relations because China has been awful and terribly unfair to our citizens and its own citizens. So that creates a problem. But China is a very advanced country, very innovative, very technological. And it is a country that gets, for its own political reasons, that needs to move on climate change, and it's an important partner. Joe Biden's election presents a whole set of new opportunities to have an integrated North American set of policies, from going back to car emissions through to rare earth metals type policies, which brings us to China as well. To, I think, common carbon capture type policies of the sort that we're seeing in the UK 2 weeks ago announced, and with the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line networks that would go across the border and build connections, a keystone of carbon, if you will. And so that's that point. What should we be investing in? Well, I think we got to invest in several things. I think the key difference that I'll have perhaps with other people is that gas is a important transitional fuel. and you don't, you're not going to leap over this this problem in a single bound, and you want to displace worse things while you're going. And if people are willing to accept taking that financial risk, good on them to do it. I think you want to back gas. I think particularly if it's displacing coal in Asia, I think, and particularly if it's powered by hydro, like in British Columbia, not powered by the burning of fossil fuels itself. And I think you want to back carbon capture because it's a basis. It's a national unity play, which I think matters in politics in different regions, blue and green, hydrogen, and it's carbon capture is a necessity for some of it. So those are a few of the things to you back, and electrification of vehicles, obviously, of transportation.
Okay, that's a list. Got a few in there. But, a good strategy also has a number of elements to it. So thank you for giving us a good lay of the land there, Ed. Dr. Hare, I'll turn to you. What are some of the bets you think Canada should be placing in our foreign relations, in our geopolitical initiatives?
Yeah, well, I think the place to start is what we've already mentioned, which is that the oil and gas sector still continues to enjoy large amounts of tax breaks and subsidies. Just look at LNG in BC. If we know over the long term, perhaps within the next decade, that oil and gas prices are likely to flatline as these countries make this climate change transition, why would we continue to subsidize these dinosaur industries? If you compare the amount of money that Canada or any other major economy spends on fossil fuels, R&D breaks, and the amount that it invests in clean energy, right, there's no comparison. You can see the numbers on my slides. We really spend and are investing a pittance of our money into clean energy technology, yet that's the avenue that offers the future in terms of jobs and in terms of environmental issues. So I'm not sure that I can pinpoint a certain technology. I think the markets can decide that, but what we need to do initially is reduce these distortions and try to reduce the amount of carbon lock-in. Just look at electric vehicles. Everyone is concerned about range anxiety. How do we overcome the fact that we've had 100 years of investment in fossil fuels, including retail gas stations, the whole supply network, until we have much more proactive and unified strategy towards developing this infrastructure? It's going to be difficult for us to promote the industries that we need. And I don't think that we necessarily need to choose certain technologies. We just need to make sure that there's a reasonably level playing field and that we can start to close the cost gap with fossil fuels, which will naturally happen as these technologies mature.
Maybe, and just because you spent a bit on technology there, just because Ed mentioned, partners as well, like, is there, do you see a natural affinity of, we could speak broadly of the EU or something like that, but are there any sort of particular entities that you think we should be, really closely aligning ourselves with?
Well, I think the really promising thing to me is that, Canada, outside of some areas of Ontario, was never going to be a manufacturing powerhouse. Our labor costs are just too high. But in clean tech, we could be a source of multiple jobs. You just look around Vancouver that we have biotech firms, we have startup firms in clean tech, we have a bunch of firms in IT. This is an area where Canada could really compete. And we do need to try to create possible synergies with European, with US, and potentially even with Asian partners. But the important thing is we don't have to compete on economies of scale like we did in manufacturing. We're just at this window just opening up. And as long as we get in early on, Canada can really have a host of world-beating companies. So I think it's very promising. But if you miss that window of opportunity, trying to come in late is extremely hard. And without a national or provincial strategy towards this, in any coherent fashion, my fear is that we're going to miss that window.
Folks may know British Columbia has been working with the Clean Tech Accelerator here, Foresight, to produce a provincial clean tech cluster strategy. So there's definitely work in there that is ongoing. And of course, the superclusters, well, there isn't a clean tech supercluster within Canada, Many of them do touch upon that in some of their work, but I think the digital one in particular, because there's a clean natural resources component to it. Last but not least, Eddie, what are the bets that we should be placing here? And you've got some pieces to pick up from Ed and Andy here.
Yeah, so I mean, let's do the obvious here. I think beginning with the impact of their relationship on energy and climate with the United States, that is going to be a big changer because of the interconnectedness of our economies, infrastructure, the fact that 3/4 of states, their first client is Canada. I think that there's certainly going to be a lot there. I think there's going to be also a different kind of discourse. You've heard, for example, Vice President-elect Harris speak about a coalition of phasing out fossil fuels. You've also heard Biden talk a lot about using the G20 and the G7 as an opportunity to bring countries together to think about the net zero transition. Canada hasn't yet been as forefront on those elements, and I think that it would be interesting to see how a Biden climate presidency would influence Canada when it comes to energy and diplomacy. But then, as Edward mentioned earlier, the other part of it is when it comes to climate diplomacy, a lot matters because of the China and the U.S. relationships, and that it looks like they are competing, but at the same time they're actually helping each other shape the energy landscape. And I guess two other players that are going to be there in the middle is the EU, particularly in the context of the Green New Deal and how it influences its relationships with third-party partners, and India. And so these are big countries that in the context of the negotiations on energy within the G20, that is going to shape a lot how the energy regime shapes up. I think that would be my first point. The second one is we got to look at 2021, for example, as the year of, it's going to be COP26. It's going to be a moment where all countries are going to shape the discussion on net zero. It will be interesting to see how that net zero discussion actually allows for a discussion about efficiency and how that transition actually happens. I know that, if I say here that natural gas is dirtier than fossil fuels, I know Edward is going to say, okay, yeah, I was expecting that comment. But I mean, this is going to be a live debate in 2021. So, what we need to look at in the context of Canada is that for the longest time, I mean, I'm 30 years old, but the fact is that for the past 10 years, the renewable energy industry in the country hasn't been as vocal as the oil gas sector, and I think that kind of a narrative needs to change. And I don't have the solution for that, but I do feel that there is an important potential from the renewable energy. It employs more than 2,000 Canadians, and we need to have a discussion about how do we put that in the forefront. The last thing that I would say is that it's not just energy. There are a couple of other revolutions happening, for example, on zero emissions vehicles. And Canada is not at the forefront either. Canada is not a front runner when it comes to CEF mandates. It's not a front runner when it comes to supply chains for cars. And I think we also need to think about how do we plan to make sure that the Canadian economy actually is able to champion on those areas as well.
I just want to say if Eddie's only 30, I think he should call me Mr. Greenspan.
Just mention something too.
Yeah, please go.
So if you look at the amount of money that's going into the core clean tech strategy in BC and even the digital cluster strategy, it's a pittance compared to what a comparable European country is spending.
Yeah.
And there's no linkage, there's no good linkage between university and the private sector and the government, what we call the triple helix in innovation theory. There's no real coordinated strategy across the country. And so it's a good starting point, but it's wholly inadequate to what's really required for the moment.
I have some insider baseball there, but I'll refrain from that. We do have some audience questions here, and I'm going to try to, because we're talking about the economics of this, right? And I'm going to try to pull a few together here. One of the questions that was asked was, talking about insurance and feeling like there's a need to pay more for flood insurance and so on. Have there been any studies on the cost of climate change? The answer is yes, there have been many. The one we sort of generally harken back to, I think, is the Stern Review on Climate Change back in 2006. The results in that were pretty startling. I suspect all of our colleagues here may know, but I was just trying to recall. Off the top of my head, I recall I think it was 5% of global GDP would be the cost of inaction on climate change, assuming warming greater than 2 degrees. If I'm incorrect in that, someone please straighten me out there. But to say that there is an immense cost associated with inaction on climate change, and remembering, and I think this is a really important point, it's not an either or, right? We don't, meet the Paris Accord and get to 2050 or not, and things are just, a sort of average level of bad. As some people are fond of saying, every kilogram of CO2 matters. That is a potential dollar of cost saved. That's a potential life saved in some contexts. I work in migration and displacement. There's a wonderful and terrifying report by the World Bank suggesting that there are well over 200 million people that could be displaced in equatorial Africa, South Asia, and Latin America by 2050 due to climate change. Every kg matters. So the sense that that those costs are, sort of rise to a certain level and then we just pay those costs is inaccurate. Those costs get higher at every point that CO2 rises, and every day we delay, the costs are more expensive in the future. So I just want to answer that one right out of the gate. Let's talk about carbon pricing, because we always have to talk about carbon pricing because we're Canadians. And I don't want to talk about Canadian carbon pricing as much, because I think that's probably boring for most of us. Let's talk carbon tariffs. Is that, and for those who aren't familiar, carbon tariffs being the idea that if Canada is a country that will maintain carbon pricing and other countries are not doing so, that we might have a border adjustment fee that's placed on goods or services coming into, entering Canada that have a potential carbon differential and don't have a price of carbon applied on that. I think that's a tool that's talked about a lot. It seems to be coming up more and more. I wonder if any of our panelists have any thoughts on whether or not it's a good tool and what the trade-offs associated with it might be.
Okay, I guess for dead air, I'll start. I think it's a very dangerous tool. First off, I think it could become a very real tool. And as we know, the EU is doing a lot of work, and President-elect Biden had it in his platform. So I think, Canada and every country better beware that, I spend a lot of time in exports. We're going to do a project on exports, and it's, built very much around low carbon exports. I mean, how do we get carbon out of our exports, and how do we build industries, like digital industries that are inherently low carbon? Shopify, now the most valuable company in Canada, doesn't export a lot of carbon. So, that's, and nobody uses zero energy, of course, but that's a piece of it. I think the danger in here, of course, is that there's a protectionist mood out in the world. Protectionism isn't good for anybody in the world, and it's particularly not good for, rules-based open economies that need to export like our own. And the potential for this to be abused by countries is very great. So that's it's not it itself; it's how it might be used.
Your answer?
So, I don't think it's not that of a bad measure. I think it has a lot of, in theory, good potential. And maybe just to explain quickly, the CBAM, how we call it, the carbon border tariff. It's just a measure that measures the carbon content of imports through their basic material consumption. And so I think this debate is actually happening as the WTO is thinking about the modernization of trade rules, this is the moment to think about how you create a level playing field when it comes to taking into consideration the emissions of imported goods. And so, I feel that once the EU move forward with this policy, it is going to shape the United States, CBAM, and potentially even Canada. And I definitely agree that there are going to be a lot of questions about how other countries, they use this kind of tool in the future. But trade deals also have do that kind of incentive to get all countries to the same level playing field. So, this is just, in the EU context, this is an opportunity to make sure that we consider the carbon content of the imports, but also that the revenues are used for greater climate policies at the domestic level. So there could be also many benefits that come with it. That I think the elements of equity that could be aligned to it, or competitiveness, these could be dealt with, but it's not a measure that needs to be excluded. I think the other part of this discussion is this notion of carbon clubs, which is a group of countries that share the same kind of regional policies when it comes to carbon pricing, when it comes to making sure that they have the same level of ambition on climate policy, and CBAM is also part of that discussion on making sure that countries are elevating their climate policy to be consistent with their international climate obligations.
Okay, carbon clubs, excellent new term to throw in. Dr. Hira, do you want to add some more thoughts on?
Yeah, I don't really see, I think we all have this general idea, especially among academics, of the circular economy. And that means completely changing our whole production system so that we can eliminate environmental waste. That's kind of like hydrogen as an everyday fuel. It might happen in 40 or 50 years, but right now, I don't think that it's possible. I mean, how would you actually practically implement this? Because everyone talks, for example, about life cycle analysis, figuring out exactly how much waste and how much emissions is created in the process of producing any particular good. But we don't have a good methodology for figuring that out. So how would you really assess these tariffs? I think it would be challenging. What I think is more effective as we move generally towards a circular economy, that would include not only environmental assessments, but also labor and worker safety assessments and health assessments. As we start to move towards those methodologies where it will eventually become more practical, I think in the immediate term, it makes more sense for us to follow the lead of some of the investment funds in divesting ourselves out of oil and gas. SFU has had a very rancorous discussion around that, but I think it would be extremely valuable. And if you did that, in addition to stopping subsidizing and giving tax breaks to the oil and gas industry and starting to reallocate some public funding to clean energy, that would be much more efficient in terms of achieving results.
We're getting down to the wire here, so I'm gonna ask. Maybe I'll ask Eddie quickly just one of these questions. Eddie, are you aware the federal government's gender-based analysis mandate that it has there been any work to apply that in the context of the just transition? I'm not aware of any, but I'm curious if anyone else, but.
Not on the context of just transition. The Canadian government has, however, applied gender-based analysis to their international feminist assistance policy. The 93% of all climate finance investments that Canada has done since 2016 have some kind of gender consideration. What is lacking is investments that promote at a result-based level gender as a core component, as the principal component of the investment. So And I actually read the question. It was interesting because it actually mentioned that we're 4 dudes on the panel, and that person is right. There is certainly missing a female voice in this panel. And you know, this also reflects, because we're talking about mitigation mostly. A mitigation world is a male-based world still. And we've for the longest time associated adaptation to feminist policies. I think that is changing, but in the context of transitions, there's a long way to go before having a feminist approach. That said, Canada is a front runner. They're actually at the moment discussing a feminist foreign policy for the context of the 2021-2026 period.
I think if folks haven't seen, the YWCA of Canada put out a great document, a feminist recovery plan roadmap. And within that, there's some interesting language that doesn't quite express the just transition, but I think there's an understanding that of the, you know, the she session context of COVID-19, as well, that in the context of resource communities or others where there are difficulties associated with the transition, that women are often the first and the most harshly impacted because they're picking up the slack in a number of different respects. So clearly there's a core need for this work, but as we're saying, as Eddie was saying, it doesn't seem to have been done yet in the context of the just transition. We are almost at time here, and I'm just trying to see if there's one more I can sneak in, but I think I'm going to ask each of our panelists here to just offer one, you know, in a sentence, a closing thought that you want to leave the audience with, and then I'll turn it over to Ben here. And I'll pick Dr. Hira to start us off.
Sure. I just want to reiterate the point I made during our discussion, which is we're at the opening of a whole new age of clean technology, and fossil fuels are going to transition out. So the question for us is Canada going to seize this opportunity and develop the kind of economy that's necessary and will provide thousands of good jobs? Or is it just going to continue to waffle and hope that somehow we'll ride the coattails of another economy, or continue to be a branch plant of large US MNCs? I think we have an opportunity to choose our own fate here.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hira. Ed?
So I would just, you know, take a moment to cry for Canada. It's a very complex country. You know, it's a lot easier to govern climate and energy policies in Europe and in many other nations. We're large, we're cold, we're a federation with very different economic bases across the country. We are an oil producer. We happen to have fairly carbon intensive oil. And when you add all of these things up, you better be very good at your policy and your politics. Very, very good. Like Norway is very good, for instance, as an oil exporting nation. But the fact is we're not good. And until we have particularly a consensus of the 2 potential governing parties at the federal level, who can plan? You know, who can plan if every 4 or 8 years you think it's going to switch over? And just while you're crying, on my last point, I cry a little bit for people who might want to help build that consensus, even between Alberta and the federal government. I don't think this is an impossibility. In fact, I think it's quite possible. But you have a Prime Minister of Canada who's hemmed in a bit by the need to build a majority in regions of the country and in generations of the country that are particularly antithetical to an oil industry or transition in an oil industry. And you have a Premier of Alberta who is, I believe, has the potential to be Nixon to China because he's Nixon, which is a precondition for being Nixon to China. But he's hemmed in by a right on his party that could break away. So the politics of this country are really difficult at a time where we really need them to be exceptional.
Thank you, Ed. Eddie, last word.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the first thing that I would say is that since the beginning of the climate regime and the UNFCCC, which is as old as I am, and since the 5th anniversary, since the adoption of the Paris Agreement, we're celebrating its 5th anniversary. The climate regime has never had a mechanism to phase out fossil fuels. Actually, the Paris Agreement never mentions fossil fuels or oil for that matter. It mentions carbon intensive measures and so on. And last year, the production gap report said that national governments plan fossil fuel expansions would actually lock 120 times more emissions that was needed to stay to 1.5 degrees. So of course, there's the political feasibility, but we also have, to understand that time at this moment is gold. Every minute that is lost in political battles, it's a minute that we don't have to transition towards a world that is safer at this moment. And the risk that we impose into future generations is going to be greater if we continue on this lockdown on political climate ambition. And so we really need to think about other creative tools. And there's one that I have seen and that I feel it's an interesting one, which is the Non-Proliferation Treaty, that actually speaks about a political engagement to stop fossil fuel expansion. But there are many others. What I want to say is that while there is a lot of political lack of political willingness, we need to recognize that in these 10 years that we have right now to change our policies, every minute matters.
Every minute matters. That's a great line to end on. For my part, I think I'm seeing that, there's something here. There's something that is possible. Nixon goes to China moment, as you said, Ed. We do all share, as I think each of you said in different ways, a need for a healthy, stable climate. And if we can't agree on that, then we're really in big trouble. But certainly that the love we share for this land, and I go back to the comments I made about Indigenous relationships being so core to all of this. We love this place. We love this land we live on, wherever it may be, whatever you might call it across Canada. There's something very special about the place, the physical place in which we live and the people with which we live. And that should be a core motivating animation of what we do moving forward. So I want to thank all the panelists for offering some really insightful and interesting comments. Thank you to the audience for throwing some wonderful questions in there. I apologize for not getting to all of them. And thank you to CIC for hosting such a wonderful conversation. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Ben. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. And thank you very much to our speakers. I really enjoyed hearing this discussion, and I do feel like it can go on for another while. I hope that our audience also feels the same way. I very much look forward to seeing what types of policy recommendations tonight's discussion may lead to down the road, because the lovely thing about the format for these events is that there is quite a bit of work to do in the aftermath. Asma Patel, my colleague and friend, is behind the organization of tonight's successful event, and I'd like to hand things over to her to briefly tell us about the next Global Ambition project events that we have on the horizon.
Thank you, Ben. So as Ben mentioned, this event is the launch of our Global Economy series in advancing foreign policy by Canadians. Our next event will be held on November 28th, and this is on women in the global economy, focusing on the 2018 UN flagship report, Turning Promises into Action. The event will be at 5:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And then our next event after that is December 2nd, where we focused on the global economy, speaking on the future of AI technology and supply shifts. And finally, for CIC Vancouver, we will have one on December 3rd, where we will continue this conversation on climate change. In addition to that, our partner on the global economy, CIC Victoria, will also be doing a global economy series, and they will be hosting their first event on December 1st on the topic of the Indo-Pacific, what's next, and where is next for Canada's global trading interests. So that's our events coming up, and like Ben said, we would appreciate if you could join us in our series in advancing foreign policy by Canadians. I'll hand that back off to you, Ben.
Thanks, Asma. As we continue to roll out our deliberative democracy exercise, your participation, as Asma was saying, and as I said earlier, is more important than ever. I invite you to attend our future Global Ambition Project events and to continue using your voice in shaping the future of Canadian foreign policy. Any support which you can bring us will also bring this project closer to achieving its ambitious goals. The name, I suppose, is the Global Ambition Project after all. If you would like to join a welcoming community of foreign policy enthusiasts here in Vancouver, I also encourage you to become a member of our branch, and you'll be able to access many more great events and discussions like this one. That about concludes our event for this evening, so thank you very much for joining us. Thank you once again to our speakers and to our moderator, and have a nice evening.
Everyone, thanks so much.